It is natural to believe that there is something bizarre about the spectacle of a US president possibly preparing to abandon a European country resisting domination by Moscow, and perhaps even to wave off a chunk of the continent into a Russian sphere of influence. But it is only 80 years and a month since the United States last connived with Russia to divide Europe, if in admittedly different circumstances. At the recent Munich Security Conference, at which this episode was recorded, Munich itself became the unavoidable metaphor. Many attendees invoked Munich in 1938, when another expansionist tyrant was offered a slice of a country that wasn't his, in the hope of calming him down. But maybe the city whose history is really haunting Europe again is Yalta, site of the 1945 summit at which US President Franklin Roosevelt chose to believe that Stalin was containable. The Stalin-Putin analogy kind of makes itself. Donald Trump, to understate the case audaciously, is no Franklin Roosevelt. It was FDR who had co-signed with Winston Churchill the 1941 Atlantic Charter, which, among other clauses, endorses the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live. There now appear to be significant transatlantic differences of opinion on this and other matters. It is clear by now that the second administration of President Donald Trump will not be a rerun of the first, i.e. weird and chaotic, but manageable. Every indication is that it will be more disruptive and potentially more dangerous. America's allies must also acknowledge that maybe the orthodoxy of 4 years of Joe Biden was the glitch, and that Trump and Trumpism is the new normal, even if normal feels like the wrong word. Why has the United States tilted away from Europe? Is there any method to the apparent madness? And how should Europe adjust? This is the Foreign Desk.
That is my fear, that they believe that we are not really committed and that European armies are still not prepared.
We are not for a system where large states make decisions over the head of small states.
We may be seeing a large reassessment of U.S. foreign policy. It's about sort of things that have a pecuniary or mercantilist value. It's not about values, it's about value.
My gut feeling is that by June or July, there will be new and different forms of opposition that we haven't seen before.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our first guest is the retired US Army officer Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former commanding general of US Army Europe. I began by asking General Hodges about the Trump administration's attitude to the US presence in Europe, and whether they don't understand the value to US security, or are just pretending they don't because they know Europe bashing plays well with their voters.
I think there's some of that, but multiple administrations have not done a good job of explaining to my three sisters that live in Florida and Georgia why this matters. They're all three total Trumpers, okay? Makes for interesting family conversations.
Thanksgiving must be a riot.
Yes. But the fact is, they're like, why are we there? And these are three educated women with educated kids. And they're like, why are we there? So the fact that even though their brother was in the Army and served in NATO 3 different times, and they're still not sure, we have a communication problem from our leadership over the years. Absolutely. That's been the most frustrating thing for me, is that after 11 years of war, Russia still only controls 20% of Ukraine. They've suffered over 800,000 casualties. Their economy is in terrible shape. They depend on North Korea for ammunition, and that's without us committing to actually helping Ukraine win. So imagine if the president were to say, you know what, it's in our interest. This is not charity for Ukraine. It's in the interest of the United States. It's in the interest of Germany, of UK, Poland, everybody, that Russia is defeated. Sovereignty in 1991 is restored. Therefore, we're going to use all of our economic tools. I mean, General Kellogg said that he gave us a 3 on a scale of 10 in terms of actually using sanctions. There's a lot of room there to improve. No restrictions on anything. Germany provide Taurus. No restrictions on what we provide with the TACMs or any other weapon system. And I think the message to the Kremlin would be that we're not going away. We're committed here. And up until now, I believe that the Russians knew that their only hope was that we would quit. That they would just have to wait for us to quit, and then they would get what they want.
How bleak does the picture then start to look if the US does quit and Ukraine is to some extent or another thrown under the bus and the war is ended largely on Russia's terms? Because most obviously then Russia suddenly has tens of thousands of troops that are no longer pinned down in Ukraine, which can be redeployed elsewhere to annoy people along other borders. And that's the point, surely, at which perhaps Putin gets tempted to see how serious people really are about Article 5.
That is my fear, that they believe that we are not really committed and that European armies are still not prepared. I mean, as long as we've been talking about this, that they still are not where they should be. But we're not there yet. I think these negotiations, however they end or conclude, are going to go on for quite some time. I don't know that, but I've evolved my thinking a little bit that this is not just a black and white, here's the line. And then there's the composition of some sort of a peacekeeping force. I mean, nobody on the planet believes that the Russians would actually live up to any agreement unless they're forced to. So that means there would have to be a force of some sort that would be capable enough and would have the rules of engagement to allow it to deter Russia from violation. I mean, they're going to test this on day one. Drones flying over no-fly areas. I think there's a record of that. So the negotiations are going to include, I would imagine, what does compliance look like? What's the compliance protocol? What kind of a force is going to be there? Now, I think it was unfortunate that the president or the secretary have already said no U.S. boots on the ground for any kind of peacekeeping force. Okay, fine. Even if you never wanted to do that, why would you say that? So anyway, that still leaves the door open for things that the U.S. can do, different ways to be a part of it. But I don't think it's unfair to ask our allies, our European allies and other countries to shoulder the burden of whatever this force looks like. But I do think that makes it incumbent on the U.S. to not just turn our back and say, good luck. The bottom line is President Trump has enormous leverage over Putin, enormous. He could just implement the things that Biden did at the end, like, sanctions. He could tell Putin, say, okay, well, if you're not prepared to deal, I'm opening up the gates. Everything that Ukraine needs, we're going to give to them. And we're going to crush you economically. He can do that, and then Putin can't do anything about it. So I think at some point, now I am not a psychiatrist, I'm not an economist, but as I'm watching this, I'm thinking, okay, I think President Trump would love to be seen as getting Putin to the table, agree to a negotiation, and then be seen as he stopped the war. And but maybe behind the scenes, he's telling him, let me tell you what, I'm not going to humiliate you publicly, but let me tell you what we are going to do if you don't do this, this, and this. The thing about NATO off the table for Ukraine, like, why would you say that? And why don't we want Ukraine in NATO? But I think what they have done as a interesting kind of reverse judo technique, Ukraine was never going to get in NATO because of Slovakia and Hungary, and I think Germany and the Netherlands also, at least not anytime soon. So here's the administration saying, okay, well, it's not going to happen, and here we can throw a bone to the Russians, and you can take credit for it, but we didn't really give away anything. Now, I'm very uncomfortable with that because I think that looks like a victory for Russia. So that's pretty murky, everything I've just said, trying to pick through it.
Just a final question then about a different theatre of conflict. Thinking back to a time when, you commanded a company or a battalion or a brigade or a division, how enthused would you have been about the prospect of you and your men being deployed to sort of rebuild Atlantic City on the Gaza Strip?
This is, there's about 100 things wrong with this, from practical things to violations of international law. And this will be a test for the senior leadership of the military when they get told, if they are told to develop plans for what would we do, how would we do it. Now, it is of course, as you know, if it's a legal order, they're bound to carry it out. That's their sworn duty to carry out a legal order. But it's also the responsibility of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, for example, our CDS equivalent, to give best military advice even when it's not requested. And so I hope, and this is not a public thing, this is obviously a very private sort of conversation that the chairman should be having with the secretary and the president, saying, well, we have some issues here. Some of them will be legal, some of them will be practical about what kind of assets and capabilities are we going to invest here. The thing is, the challenge with understanding the president is you have to take him not only seriously, but I take him literally. I used to say, don't take it literally, but take him serious. I now am more inclined to take literally what he says. Now,
so by the same token, are there kind of dusty plans dating back from about 1812 for the invasion of Canada that somebody's trying to find in a basement somewhere at the moment?
Well, we lost when we tried that, so I hope that they're looking for something different. What I do believe is, they talk about Greenland or Canada or Gaza, that these are not cliche negotiating tactics. I think he's serious. And they're going to push as far as they can to achieve whatever strategic objective that they want.
That's going to make life extremely difficult for people who are currently occupying 4-star rank, though, isn't it?
Very. Yeah, this will be the challenge. Can they make the case to explain, Mr. President, we don't, to do this would require this, and this. Okay. Now, President Obama used to hate it when military would say, here's your only option to do this. Like, why don't I get more than one option? So, I can imagine President Trump turning to his defense planners and say, all right, give me 3 options for how we would do this, but tell me all the risks associated with each one, things like that. And that's their duty to lay that out. But yes, it will be very uncomfortable. On the best of times, that's a hard job.
That was Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former Commanding General of U.S. Army Europe. This is the Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. At any Munich security conference, it is vexingly difficult for mere media to access the Bayerischer Hof Hotel, where most of the conferring occurs. We did manage at one afternoon, however, briefly establishing a pop-up studio on the freezing windswept roof, where the rest of this episode was recorded. To be clear, we had permission, no rope ladders were involved. I spoke first of all to Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director of the McCain Institute, and I began by asking if she sensed where the current US administration thinks the relationship between the United States and Europe is going.
It's unclear. There are question marks about what they want, and there are divisions within the administration because you have Secretary Rubio, you have the National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. These are traditional national security experts who I would not paint with an isolationist brush, but then the president himself has spoken in isolationist terms here and there, maybe not as much recently, and that raises other questions because he's talked about having possession of territories and canals. And so frankly, I think there are a lot of question marks. We're still early into the administration. I think it's important to understand that.
But what's your sense been of how Vance's remarks and other recent noises from the administration have landed with Europeans at this conference. Are people a bit spooked?
People are, first of all, they're angry. They don't like being lectured at. Second, they're now fearful. They are fearful that somehow America might either abandon Europe to Russia and China, or maybe even worse, make some sort of deal over the heads of the Europeans with Russia and China. So there's a lot of, like I said, anger and trepidation about what is in store now for Europe.
Have you heard much in the way of constructive conversation about what options are available to Europe right now, if that is what is going to happen, that the United States will try to deal with Russia over the head of the continent?
I mean, in the near term, there's, of course, not that much Europe can do except to insist on its prerogatives and to remind the United States what is at stake for the United States, because we are still the largest economic, political relationship in the world. I think the strongest one is U.S.-Europe. And that means that the United States also has something to lose if we lose our partnership across the board. So we need more diplomacy, clearly.
But when you think about how this will play back in the United States, does somebody in the US need to actually pick this moment to make the case for a more engaged United States, to explain to the American people why this is actually in their interest? Because it strikes me, at least, that has been a voice that has been missing to a large extent during the recent presidential campaign, but certainly in the last few weeks since Trump was re-inaugurated.
Yes, I think we need that voice. We need many voices to make the point that our security is connected to Europe's security. Again, Europe is our largest economic, political, military partner, and therefore we have to stand united against the autocrats, against Russia, against China. And frankly, we are not for a system where large states make decisions over the head of small states. We're not for going back to the 19th century and protectionism and trade wars that lead to actual wars. So I think people need to articulate exactly what it means to go down a path that is no longer the one that we were on before, which is building ever-increasing interconnectivity.
And just to go back finally to that anger you mentioned that was expressed and felt by a lot of the people who heard Vice President Vance's speech, and you are quite right, Europeans historically don't react terribly well to Americans yelling at them about what they're doing wrong, especially not when they do it in Europe. But do you detect any amount, I guess, of rueful reflection on the part of Europeans to the effect that, well, we can't say we weren't warned?
What I do detect is an acknowledgement that maybe the Americans and, frankly, Eastern Europeans were right all along, that maybe we, and now I'm thinking mostly of Western Europe, Germany in particular, that maybe we were too complacent, maybe we were too optimistic about Russia, or maybe we put financial interests before other interests, before our values at times. So I think there is a rueful understanding that perhaps for too long Germany and Germans had blinders on. And of course, it's rooted in the history, the World War II and the devastation and the desire not to repeat those horrible episodes. But yet, Germany, Japan now need to stand up to autocrats again. And this time, they're not the autocrats. And they need to understand that they're on the right side and they need to fight now for the correct values.
That was Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director of the McCain Institute. This is the Foreign Desk. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Our next guest is Kurt Volker, Distinguished Fellow at the Centre for European Policy Analysis, former US Ambassador to NATO, and US Special Representative for Ukraine during the first Donald Trump administration. I began by asking if he thought Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had any shot at making a case to Donald Trump that Trump's interests might be on Ukraine's side and not Russia's.
He is making that case, and they are talking, and they had a detailed exchange about minerals. I think the vice president brought it up with Zelensky here. The Treasury Secretary went to Kyiv. I think there's a deal in the making there. I honestly think there is. And that means it's a it's a resource that the U.S. and President Trump would then have a vested interest in, including an interest that it be secure and accessible. So that does change a bit the dynamic there, and it gives him a direct interest. In addition to that, I think that President Trump knows very well that Putin is the aggressor here. Ukraine is defending itself, but his focus is on stopping the fighting. He doesn't see a way that Ukraine will retake its territory militarily, and Zelensky has said that as well. He doesn't see how we can do that militarily. So he wants to stop the fighting and put this into a non-kinetic phase of dispute.
But do you think that there is really a prospect of a peace that can be agreed to by Ukraine, which President Zelensky can sell to Ukraine's people who have suffered horrendously for 3 years, and that isn't going to come back to bite everybody a few years down the track?
Right. No, I don't think so. What I think is possible is a ceasefire. Both sides agree to stop the fighting, and that's what President Trump is leaning on the most. Then I think President Putin will make wildly unreasonable demands that neither Ukraine nor anyone in Europe could agree to. And we end up with a non-agreement. So you have a ceasefire and no agreement, and we end up focusing on deterrence. How do you deter the next war? How do you prevent Putin from attacking again? And that's what I think all this talk about a deterrence force, European troop presence, whether there's American backup for that, training, equipping, Ukrainian military, continued sanctions, that's where all that's coming from. Because the expectation, at least my expectation, but I think it's pretty widely shared, is that in the end of the day, you're not going to reach an agreement with Vladimir Putin because he won't agree to anything reasonable.
It does also, of course, include NATO countries. And just as a final thought, are you confident, because I suspect a lot of Europeans aren't, that should Article 5 become a thing that the US actually would turn up? Like, even if it...
Yeah.
And you know the nightmare scenarios.
Yeah.
Russia bites off a small chunk of Latvia or Estonia and says, are we doing World War III over this?
Well, that's... Yes. So first off, if there's a blatant attack against a NATO country, I do think that we would come to defense. It is critical for all of Europe that we do. And fortunately, all of the Baltic states and Poland and the Nordics, they're all paying more than 2% of GDP on defense. So that question is not brought up. But what I worry about is the scenario you suggested, where Putin does a little bit and doesn't persist, just, something in one of the Baltic states. And they won't be wearing Russian markings. Right. It'll be little green men. It'll be a hybrid operation. They seize something. And then I think not only the United States, but you're going to have a lot of Europeans saying, do we really want to go to war over this? And a lot of them would answer that no. And that's the first crack in what is NATO going to do. And I don't think that we are poised either in Europe or in the U.S. to answer this robustly yet. But I hope we come back to that.
That was Kurt Volker, Distinguished Fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis and former U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine. You're listening to The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. The tone of this year's Munich Security Conference was set by US Vice President J.D. Vance, whose speech was about as far as might be imagined from the transatlantic bonhomie that usually characterises the event. Our next guest is Jeremy Bash, Managing Director at Beacon Global Strategies LLC and former Chief of Staff at the CIA and the Pentagon. I began by asking what he'd made of Vice President Vance's address.
I thought that the Trump administration was going to come here in its first month in office and try to be statesmanlike. I mean, they had won a big election in the U.S., and normally, you can sort of afford to be a little more generous and talk about the importance of alliances, talk about the importance of democracies, talk about the importance of the West. And I sort of thought what they would say with respect to Ukraine was, we're going to keep all of our options on the table. And I say that because I'm not sure they exactly have formulated what they want the end game to be. And before you know what the end game is, you want to kind of keep all your options on the table. So I was a little surprised that we heard talk about withdrawing troops or not using troops. I was surprised we heard about blocking NATO accession. That's the kind of thing that they critique the prior administration for doing, which is taking options off the table.
I mean, is it clear to you, and you're right, you would think that would be the normal thing an incoming administration would do, sort of come to Europe, make nice transatlantic alliance, which is what the Munich Security Conference is usually at least in part a celebration of. But Vice President Vance notably didn't do that. Is it clear to you, therefore, how this administration actually views the future of the United States-Europe relationship?
Well, I think first we may be seeing a large reassessment of U.S. foreign policy. I mean, since the end of World War II, the U.S. has been kind of the underpinning force in the global international order. It's, by the way, an order that has worked to the benefit of the United States and the American people. And so presidents from John F. Kennedy to Ronald Reagan to Joe Biden and everybody in between has sort of, for the most part, sounded this theme that the U.S. and its European allies are an important pillar for democracy, for freedom, for the values that we share. And I think that sort of concept of values was really lacking from the tone and tenor of the conversation here. What's I think happening is this reassessment is causing kind of the U.S. interest definition to be very small. It's shrinking. It's about, critical minerals, or it's about chips, or it's about beachfront property. It's about sort of things that have a pecuniary or mercantilist flavor or value. It's not about values. It's about value. And that's just a different model for American global leadership.
I mean, American global leadership, though, has always been at least a little bit about both of those things, though, hasn't it? I mean, the United States acts in its self-interest like all other countries do.
100%. And we do promote American businesses. We do try to open markets to U.S. goods and services and those from our allies and partners. And our strong economy, I have always thought, has been the reason we can spend $800 billion on defense and in some ways be the key pillar in Nato, because we've got a great economy. So I love the fact that an administration will talk about the importance of growing the U.S. economy, but every administration talks about that. It's really, what else do you stand for in the world? Because unfortunately, I think if you don't stand for certain values and you don't stand up for democracy, you're going to find that your partners are not going to be with you. And we need our partners in Europe. I say this as an American, we in the United States need our partners in Europe. We need them to be aligned with us vis-a-vis Russia. We need them for the great technological and economic competition against China. We need them to combat terrorism and to help with places in the world that are unstable. There's a vacuum in Syria. There's a vacuum in many countries in Africa. You think the United States is going to do all that alone? No, we need partners in Europe, and Europe has a lot at stake. So it would be a natural partnership to try to fortify.
But as we are trying to figure out what this administration is going to look like and how it is going to interact with the rest of the world, especially with its allies, I'm interested, especially given your background in intelligence, how worried / nervous / terrified you are when you see people like Tulsi Gabbard being made Director of National Intelligence, Kash Patel as Director of the FBI. These are not, I think it's fair to say, the kind of people who would have got anywhere near jobs like that in any other administration.
Yeah, maybe so. But, it's also, frankly, a little hard for me to say, given the election and given the fact that they were confirmed by the Senate, that somehow they're not going to do a good job. I think we got to wait and see what kind of job they do and then judge them on that. But what I do know is that when I went into the intelligence community in 2009, after President Obama was elected, I was also essentially a political appointee there. I came in with the director of the CIA as his chief of staff. And our view was, let's work with the professional staff here, because these are the people that understand how operations are conducted, how analysis is conducted, how covert action is conducted, how liaison operations are conducted. And my view was that if we just jettison the professional staff, the career intelligence professionals, we're going to be lost and we're going to screw up. And I guarantee you, if we had fired everybody or let a lot of people go or cleaned house, we would have screwed up big time. But instead, we had a very effective 2 years taking it to al-Qaeda, taking out Osama bin Laden, decimating the leadership of that terrorist organization, also doing a number of important operational activities vis-a-vis our other adversaries. And it could only have been done, I promise you this, with career professionals.
Just as a final thought then, and I'm very interested in your perspective on this, given your long history working inside and outside American intelligence and American politics. Every so often I do just pause to think of how incredibly weird this all looks, because I am old enough to remember when, if there was one thing on which you could depend in an uncertain world, it is that the Republican Party of the United States would have been absolutely foursquare behind a European country being menaced by Moscow. I mean, how are you able to account for that change in mindset?
Well, the Ronald Reagan, quote, peace through strength, which is being much discussed now again, really requires strength. You can't have peace without strength. And if the U.S. is going to withdraw, or they're going to say we're not in, or we're going to say we're going to force Ukraine to capitulate to a bad deal that we're going to make with Russia without Ukraine, which is what President Zelensky warned against today, or if the United States says we're going to not back our key NATO partnership, or we're going to define American interests very small, then that's not strength. I think that's in some ways transmitting the opposite.
Are you able to account for why they've arrived at this line of thinking, though? Does any of it make any obvious sense to you?
Well, I think there's been a rising tide of nationalism, and in some ways populist anger in the United States, where I'm from, but also all over the world, is a phenomenology that I think we're going to have to understand better.
That was Jeremy Bash, former Chief of Staff at the CIA and at the Pentagon. This is The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. My final guest is Timothy Snyder, Professor of History at Yale and a historian who has specialised in Central and Eastern Europe. His latest book, On Freedom, is a rumination on a concept which, at least in theory, is supposed to be an abiding interest of the United States, at home and abroad. I began by asking if there is anything in American history, in terms of its relationship with Europe, that is any kind of useful guide to what we are witnessing or what we might be about to witness.
Yeah, America First, the 1930s. I mean, America First is a conscious and, I believe, a correct political reference. So like in the U.S., we have this big to-do about are you allowed to make comparisons with the 1930s? But but America First, which is Trump's chief slogan, or one of them, is a direct and specific reference to the 1930s. And what America First means is we don't care about Europe. Let them solve their problems. We are in general on the side of the white people against the non-white people. Fascism is just fine. Maybe we'll try it here too. And that pretty much sums it up. And so, yes, I think the 1930s are a perfectly reasonable comparison for the U.S. The 1930s, the Lindbergh 1930s, the 1930s, which almost happened but didn't quite happen, but specifically the America First movement, because that was their logic. We are basically isolationist. We will intervene maybe sometime when it's really in our direct economic interests. For the time being, the main thing we're concerned about is the immigration of the black and brown people. And in that sense, we're on the side of the fascists, and that's today. So yes, absolutely.
All of that does sound familiar, but going back to the 1930s, and speaking with particular reference to that parallel Lindberghian United States that never happened, is it possible that absent the Second World War, the US might have proceeded down that authoritarian trajectory?
Oh, I think absent Roosevelt, the chances are very good. The social welfare state and the Keynesian economics that we undertook beginning in the 30s turned things around. In the Second World War, one way to see the Second World War is as the last stage of the Rooseveltian transformation of the American economy. Had we had much more of that sort of depression, it's hard to see how we come back. And I mean, that's a different parallel today because, of course, we're not in depression now. But what we do have that we had back then are stratospheric levels of wealth inequality. Mm-hmm. And that has a specific effect on politics, which I think does lead to this notion that a lot of Americans have that you have to hustle, you have to cheat, and therefore it's normal for somebody like Trump to be the president because the rules don't really work. Obviously, your hero should be somebody who breaks the rules. And that creates so I think that part of the economic resemblance creates a certain political space, which explains a little bit why we've got the people we've got.
Do you see the trajectory from here as inevitably downhill?
No, I think it's more like, it's a good point. Like it's like a boulder that's going down a mountain, but the boulder hits some things and it breaks into some other boulders, and then it might be caught by some trees, and they are trying to go quickly, but it's a multiple they where. I mean, I made the British person next to me at lunch just now laugh by calling it pluralistic imperialism. There's not one single idea of what they're doing. They're all kind of, and there are some contradictions in their camp, like, do we care about our voters at all, or are we just completely openly oligarchic? Are we going after other people's mineral resources, or are we completely isolationist? Do we really want to deport people, or is it just a show? And those are real tensions within their camp, but also, as time goes by, their policies will have consequences that people don't like. Right now they're in the pleasant phase of they get to define what they're doing as slashing bureaucracy. And who doesn't want to slash bureaucracy,
Sure.
right? But when it gets to the point where it becomes clear that what they've actually done is disable a lot of the government, I think that's going to be less popular. And then you are starting to see some engines of reaction rev up with the lawsuits and some creative Democrats in some states. So no, I don't think it's inevitable. What I think is that so many things are in motion that the collisions are going to be unpredictable, both in terms of the policy consequences, but also the forms of opposition. My gut feeling is that by June or July, there will be new and different forms of opposition that we haven't seen before and won't necessarily be related to the Democratic Party or even to people that we've heard of.
And what sense have you been able to make, either in this term so far or in his previous term, of Trump and where he comes from in American history? I mean, you partially answered that by mentioning Lindbergh, which was a sort of potential authoritarian parallel universe, but it strikes me, and you would obviously know much better, that is this the first authentic personality cult in US history, where there are people willing to say that 2 + 2 = 5 if the great leader says it does?
Yeah, I would pause on the great leader thing because that definitely is a phenomenon. And it's really striking how it's penetrated even into a lot of the media, but also the people who were working for this administration. Like, I mean, as you kindly keep mentioning, I'm a historian, and I used to read a lot of books that were published under communism, and I would be reading scholarly articles, and there was always the first page where they said, you know, as the great Lenin said, you know, and you had to get past the great Lenin part until you get, and when I listen to American officials now, it's always like, here's page 1, the great Lenin, as the great Lenin says, you know, and then maybe they move on to say something else, but like the great Lenin part has become mandatory. I mean, I'm an American historian, I'm not an American historian, but I think Andrew Jackson maybe, but you're right. I don't think we've had presidents that were revered, like Roosevelt by many, Kennedy by many, but we haven't had presidents who wanted to be revered or only wanted to be revered, who so obviously were, you know, charismatic sponges, whose charisma was there to absorb the life force of others. We haven't had that before.
That was Timothy Snyder. His latest book, On Freedom, is available now. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle Magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.